Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, my conversation with Katherine Stewart today is going to remind you that we must get to work. And that's why I need you to go to jointheunion.us. That's jointheunion.us and sign up to volunteer today. Guys, in the coming days and weeks, we are going to be expanding our efforts to the entire country to have everybody doing something in their communities. Go to jointheunion.us and sign up today. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm once again joined by Katherine Stewart, an expert on anti-democratic groups and the Christian nationalist movement, which she's covered for over 15 years. Her latest book, available wherever fine books are sold, is Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, which is in many ways the follow-up to her previous book, The Power Worshippers, which I had the pleasure to speak with her about this time last year. Katherine, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
As usual, you have it's both a page turner and a highlighter killer. So I'm not even sure where to start, but let's start here. Um, I think the one thing that your book reminded me of, and I think it's so important for everybody to understand this, is how well organized the Christian nationalist, anti-democratic, Seven Mountains, Prosperity Gospel, Project 2025, Claremont Institute, Leadership Institute, right? There are more groups with more people, with more funding, right? As you note throughout the book, right? A lot of it tax deductible because it's done through churches. And it's not new either, right? When people are like, oh, we have to build something, I'm like, yes, we do. But guys, we're 50 years behind. And the infrastructure alone, and I want to get to this a little bit later in our conversation as well, the infrastructure alone didn't arrive overnight, and it certainly won't disappear overnight. But just delve into, especially in the last 15 years or so, what you have seen through your research and what you've seen as you've gone to so many of these events.
Thank you so much, Reed. The strength of this movement is in its dense organizational infrastructure. And it doesn't mean that the movement, different sectors of the movement, aren't at odds with one another in certain respects. So, for instance, the new right and the religious right are two sectors of the movement, and in some ways there's some aspects in which they're at odds. But they regard their partnership as kind of the price of doing business. They're all sort of swimming in the same headwaters, so to speak. And we've seen the strength of this movement is really in 50 years of investment in this infrastructure. So, again, the movement is leadership driven, organization driven. We can divide the different organizations into certain categories. There are right wing policies, there are think tanks, there's a vast sort of legal ecosystem, sort of Christian nationalist legal ecosystem. There are networking organizations that get different factions of the leadership on the same page. There are very sophisticated data operations. You have a vast sort of far right, I would say, information sphere, or sometimes a disinformation sphere, messaging sphere. So all of these different features of the movement work together to sort of produce the anti-democratic movement that we're seeing today.
Right, and as you note throughout the book, the purveyors of the new right, whether or not it's like the Russ Voughts of the world who's now the head of OMB, is one of the principal authors of Project 2025, or Curtis Yarvin, this goon who, has been a blogger forever, right? And basically believes that the United States should be under some sort of monarch CEO type, right? Are different, but they're aligned in this idea of a singular source of power, be it spiritual or temporal.
That's absolutely true. I mean, the ideas that they have are deeply un-American. The idea is that the United States is not founded on any principle, uh, or the ideals of equality and pluralism and justice, and the ideals that our laws should be deliberated in public, and our leaders should be subject to, ethics and legal constraints. But their idea is that the America is founded on a specific religion and cultural heritage. It's on the brink of an apocalypse due to the rise of equality and what they call wokeness, that anyone to the left of them is somehow a woke communist, and this includes, many Republicans who, don't happen to be sort of MAGA friendly, and the idea that democracy won't solve the problems that we're facing. The rules don't apply anymore. So what we need really is a strong man, right? An authoritarian leader who puts himself above the law and is going to seize the reins of power and scrap the rule of law in favor of the iron fist.
Right, yeah, and, this comes from page 117, let's see, the it said, "One could hardly ask for a finer example of Claremont's idea of the, quote, Straussian man in action. His mission is to save the republic. He must tell a few lies, yet he is nonetheless a noble liar, at least in his own mind. He acts in the political world where natural right reigns, and not merely in the legal world where lawyers are supposed to toil. Aware of the crooked timber from which humanity is made, he is prepared to break off whatever branches are needed for the bonfire of liberty." First of all, that's a great sentence, right? That's like you should be proud of the sentence in itself, but it's so true, right? Whether or not it's he can do it because he has to. They can do it because we need this. He's, these people are the Cyrus, talking about Trump, right? He's the Cyrus who saved let the Jews go back to Jerusalem, even though he wasn't Jewish. All of these things to further rationalize and then, what's the right word? Institutionalize this idea that whatever it is they want to do is right, and any opposition to it is woke. And you use this word a lot, Catherine. I want to get to this demonic.
Well, the movement is drawing new energy from a religious movement, independent, charismatic networks that uh, are very they talk about demons all the time. You go to those gatherings or networking events for their pastors, and they're always talking about anybody who doesn't agree with their political aims as demonic or satanic under the thumb of Satan. And those movements are, by the way, transnational and also multiracial. They're kind of diversifying the movement to some degree. Um, but they're also themselves politically diverse when you look, broadly speaking, but they're very easily given over. Like a large sector of those independent charismatic networks are given over to these sort of hard right politics. They see spiritual, battles in the spiritual realm playing out here and now in our politics today. They say God's hand is on Donald Trump's shoulders, and he is the king that we need who's going to restore order to our nation.
So many of the people we've talked about, and you write about the Claremont Institute, all of these people at the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, and these very bespoke, religious, I guess they're philosophers, they're preaching. Um, a lot of that stuff is pretty either fringy, arcane, weird, not entirely digestible. Look, I feel like I'm pretty well read, but some of this stuff is just sort of beyond me, even, Catherine. So, how do you take it from, the elite, whether or not again it's in the real world, so to speak, or the spiritual world? How do they collect individuals with stuff? Like, how does it spread out from a very narrow, again, bespoke idea to something that is able to capture what we've seen tens of millions of Americans and hundreds of millions of more around the world?
This really leads to the religious nationalism piece of it. Christian nationalism is arguably, I would say, the single most important piece of the anti-democratic reaction because it's an ideology and a political machine that motivates a lot of voters uh, or local activists, people I refer to as the foot soldiers of the movement. So many of them may not themselves identify as Christian nationalists, but with their actions, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. This is where I think it's really important to understand the distinction between the leadership and the rank and file. The leaders want power, they want access to public and private sources of money, they want to be a new elite. But how do they get the rank and file on board? With an agenda that's actually going to impoverish them and make it harder for their families to succeed. Well, they do that by sort of dangling religious nationalism and the culture wars that the movement is weaponizing for the politics of outrage, and they get people to vote on those issues, and that's how they're able to consolidate power. There's a movement that claims to stand for the American family, but they're driving support for politicians whose policies are gonna make it so much harder for so many American families to succeed.
Let me stick on that for a second because so many of my friends, I mean, look, I'm not a Democrat. I guess I'm a small L liberal, right? I don't even know where I stand anymore, Catherine. One of the tens of millions of homeless politically people in the country. Um, but, so many of them say, "Well, how," but they're voting against their own interests. They vote against their own interests. And I try and explain to them, that old LBJ quote, any man a king who has someone to look down on. If they're voting against their material interests, explain a little bit about how they're actually voting in their own minds in their spiritual interests.
Well, of course they are because, listen, over the past decades, we've seen a massive concentration of wealth at the tippy top of the economic spectrum. And, so a lot of people feel like they have a sense of falling behind when you see the vast pace of technological change. A lot of people feel like they're getting left behind. They look at how things were for their moms and dads, and they say, dad could buy a house, mom didn't have to work. Dad made enough of a salary to support us on one income for a while, and, the public schools were good. Not that things were like this all over the country or for everybody, but by any means. But there was a much greater sort of, less wealth inequality, let's say in the 1950s, which is the halcyon days that this movement is always hearkening back to.
Right. When Eisenhower was president, taxes were 90%, and he was a big supporter of both infrastructure, desegregation of schools, and labor unions.
Exactly, and not everybody at the top paid that 90%, but at least it was the average amount people paid was a lot higher, and the average CEO made something like, I don't know, 20 something times the wage of an average worker, so they could have maybe a second house, a boat, send kids to private school, whatever you want. They could have a nice lifestyle. Well, today, the average CEO of a Fortune 500 company makes in the hundreds of times the average age of the American worker. A lot of the funders of the movement, like that are funding sort of right wing culture war issues, they're also funding the sort of initiatives to weaken or destroy unions. They're funding laws that actually hurt the American worker, that, like, reduce rights for the American worker. A lot of people are struggling. So here's where the movement leaders come in. They come in and they say, all of your resentments are due to this group of people over here, which is not the, which is not the group of people that shuttered their factory or eliminated, I don't know, overtime pay or whatever else it is that they feel like has made their lives harder. It's not shuttering their public schools. It's not making the cost of living higher, the cost of housing higher. It's some like something involving sex or sexuality that, just becomes incredibly distracting for everybody. And they say these group of people are ruining society and therefore, we're fighting for you. And it's very distracting. I think of those whatever you think of whatever those culture war issues are,
Right.
the bigger picture is that they're used to incite the politics of outrage and to distract people from the real issues that are making their lives harder.
Right, and I mean, you talked about that a little bit, which is it could be, the trans issue, it could be critical race theory, it could be
Right.
DEI. You sort of infer this a bunch in the book, but the language matters insofar as that it changes enough to keep the outrage flames growing.
Exactly.
If you feel like critical race theory has sort of run its course, right, as something people are scared about, or that it's run its course because you've overturned a bunch of school boards on its back, then we'll go to DEI, right? And, say, you're not getting ahead because of them. Your kid didn't get into school because that kid who looks like that did.
Right. And this isn't to say that there aren't some diversity programs that bear scrutiny, right? But that's not why they're doing it. They're using this as a smokescreen for a money grab and a power grab. And they're also using it to legitimize, frankly, racism. And they're preparing to launch a total war on anti-discrimination law.
Right, which again is par for the course, right? And again, going back to the what we said just, 15 minutes ago, Catherine, no, very little of this is new. it's repackaged, it's redistributed, it's made ready for the 21st century. It's made ready for charismatic leaders, both again political and in the church. But again, we're going back to the times of, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, Jim Crow, right before the Civil Rights Movement. The big shift from Southern Democrats to Southern Republicans to welfare queens to Willie Horton, right? Again, it's all just a matter of what's going on. I mean, you talk about the moral majority and Jerry Falwell, and everything again comes back to this whole idea of, we need religious liberty. Of course, the irony there is they want religious liberty for the people that agree with them, but anybody who doesn't needs to be controlled by said religion.
I know, it's interesting. When you're speaking about this, I think of a quote that I have in my previous book, The Power Worshippers, from James Henley Thornwell. He was a leader of the Southern Presbyterian Church, and he was defending slavery and speaking ill of the theologians who are trying to end slavery, who are supported emancipation. And I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit because I can't remember the exact quote, but it's so modern. It's a quote that could be used today. He said, "We have ordered liberty and righteousness on one side," and he meant on the side of the slaveholders. And he said, communism and atheism and chaos on the other. And it's a kind of quote, and he's using this to defend the idea of America as a certain kind of Christian nation. Now, Christianity is like incredibly diverse, and we should speak about that and about the fact that many, if not most, American Christians value the social gospel. But so he's basically talking about, America should be a certain kind of reactionary Christian nation, the idea of hierarchies, whose laws should be based on the Bible, hierarchies ordained of God. He was talking about white people over black people, men over women. And this idea that anything that deviates from that order is heresy and will lead to chaos. And those ideas were sort of carried through to the mid-century with theologians like Rousas John Rushdoony, the father of Christian Reconstructionism, whose work preceded a lot of people like Doug Wilson today, the sort of Moscow, Idaho super pastor. And we know Pete Hegseth belongs to a church that's affiliated or has praised Wilson and has belonged to a church that's affiliated or has attended a church affiliated with Doug Wilson and his movement. So these ideas aren't new. But what is new is that it's been so many years that this movement has had the kind of political power that it does, and it's taking new forms. I mean, we're not looking at the same kind of, Christian nationalism that the pro-slavery theologians and slaveholders were adhering to. We're looking at something really different in a totally different form.
That's one thing that I'd like to get back to, and I skipped over this, and I'd like to go back to it, which is how the seeds were sown for this to pick up so many people. And for 50 years worth of work and billions of dollars worth of investment, right? Donald Trump didn't win by that much, right? So, but he won by enough. And so I want to go back a little bit because here's what you said when you were in Las Vegas with the German camera crew, and they were, when they saw a guy wearing a Blitzkrieg t-shirt, they're like, what the hell is going on here?
I know.
But you said something here that I think is worth understanding. You said, quote, the people that are attending said events, they tend to be white, 60 years old, not super wealthy, but, maybe they got a boat, right? They are, in a sense, what is left of the non-college educated middle class in a country that has left that class behind in a cloud of dust. And so to me, this is where I don't want to make a both sides argument, Catherine, but I'm going to make a both sides argument, which is the economic striation, the economic dislocation that has occurred since the 1980s, you know, is maybe not the sole reason, but it's certainly an accelerant to how we've gotten here today. And my friend Lauren Windsor did a movie, and the beginning of it was like sort of how we got to MAGA. But the beginning of it is going into these factory towns where, when they were factory towns and they were unionized, they were heavily Democratic, big D Democratic. The Democrats had their infrastructure, But when you start outsourcing, deindustrialization, NAFTA, neoliberalism, whatever it is you want to call it, start to take hold, the factories close, the unions leave. These people are up for grabs politically.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important to understand that in this time, as we start to think about, and we'll get to this a little later, as we start to think about this, like, we have to come to grips with how we got here and not do more of the same to try and get out of it.
I think you're absolutely right about that. There are a lot of different factors that are bringing us to how we got here, and we need to start. Part of the solutions, as I outline in the last section of my book, is we need to sort of start thinking about how to make life better for people so that they aren't so easily, exploited, so that life is easier for everybody, and so we can create a more perfect union. But we're not going to get that with the decapitation of the FBI, the elimination of the Consumer Fraud Bureau, which Trump and his folks are doing, and lying to the American people about the source of their problems and destroying the functions of government. You know, I think Americans have actually been subject to a long kind of propaganda campaign about government. They say it's government is terrible, and who was it who said, "I'd like to shrink it so small it could be drowned in a bathtub"?
Grover Norquist, who is one of the all-time great bagmen in Washington, D.C. too, just as an FYI,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. So, like, is there room for government efficiency, more efficiency? Of course there is, just as there in the as there is in the private sector. But I think we need to be reminded of all the good things that government can do, and that regulations can do, as well as the many bad things that happen when you have a lack of effective government, or when you have a totally cronyistic and kleptocratic government, or when you have a government where you have, so like, the richest man on earth is tapping his 21-year-old minions to, ransack the treasury and go after grandma's social security. Like, that's not going to make life better. And I think that, could you lose maybe 5% of the federal workforce, and maybe 10, maybe make everybody work a little harder? Yeah, sure you could. But at a certain point, it's sort of like sort of these private equity takeovers. If you slash too much, they are simply not going to be able to function. And, like, slashing people who handle the nuclear codes, slashing people who handle the FAA stuff, and we've got planes falling out of the sky, slashing the people at the IRS at a time when we actually need to collect taxes. This is not going to help.
Don't get crazy, Catherine, collecting taxes. But can I just say this? The first campaign I ever ran was in central Pennsylvania in 1999 and 2000. And I was a terrible campaign manager, and I was 23 or whatever, not surprisingly. But I remember, just to go back for how all this stuff sort of ladders up to now, receiving the facts from the Americans for Tax Reform, Grover Norquist Group, to have my candidate sign the no tax pledge. That was 1999. That was a quarter of a century ago, right? And we weren't the first class, right? That was probably going back to the Republican Revolution in 94. But the point is that we're now a quarter century into that anti-tax um, dogma, right? That has basically said for Republicans, like, right, if Democrats were tax and spend Democrats, Republicans are don't tax and spend Republicans, which is they have been so conditioned to be afraid of their voters, who have been so conditioned to be pissed off about having to pay anything to be part of the greatest republic so far that humanity's ever known, right? That now here we are, where in a time of, exploding deficits and debt, right? What is Congress working on as we speak? Another tax cut. Because again, 40 years, 50 years after George H.W. Bush called it voodoo economics, here we are still doing it, to your point, which is going to make the people at the top of the income scale, who are already doing far better than any of them probably could have imagined, do better. And I think you sort of referenced this, which is we're beyond tax cuts now. This is really just power and control, right? And further harm the people who need the help. And I want to get to the administrative state. But again, I think this is one of those where, unfortunately, throughout history, those who are worse off after believing in this gospel are also some of the most difficult to pry away from it.
That's really true. I mean, I think according to the free market fundamentalists, who are funding this movement. Business is always amazing. It's infinitely better than government. But I think at the same time, many Americans know that um, many of these corporate leaders are really out just to fleece them while rewarding themselves and people at the top with massive payouts. I mean, the health insurance industry, this is in the news today. I think, what's his name? That guy. It's horrible what he did. But there's been a massive outpouring of support for that murder because which
Oh,
I would
Mangione.
right. This kind of murder is just appalling. At the same time, the fact that people are sort of seeing him as a folk hero speaks to the fact that a lot of people despise the industry, the health insurance industry, because they feel like the health insurance industry despises them.
To your point, and I want to bring this all back to sort of where we are politically and how we got here too. So you said, "quote I note that much of America's political class have mostly decided that they would rather look away than acknowledge what is happening on the ground in America. It's easier for everybody, they think, if we just pretend that this is another round of politics as usual." Now, I want to bring that to a couple of things because, to your point, like our leaders in government, right? Our political leaders, like they know X, Y, and Z are screwed up, but it's not in their interests to fix it. And because it has not been in their political, financial, whatever interest to fix it, now it opens the aperture wide enough for goons and charlatans and carnival barkers like this. As I said in a piece I just wrote, they're just as bad as we are, right? And once you create that equivalence, the whole shell of the small r Republican form of government becomes very brittle, and it's very easy for people like this to start to intrude.
That's really true. There's been a real war on the truth, and coming from one side of the political aisle and not both sides of the political aisle. And I actually think the war on truth and the war on empathy as well, these are two of the most toxic legacies of this movement. Sometimes I use the term reactionary nihilism to describe this movement. I think of nihilism as a description of people whose fundamental aim is to destroy, not to create, and who deny there's any real truth or value in this world. They just see the idea of truth as another casualty in a political war. They don't have any problem inculcating lies and disinformation and making sectors of the American public believe in wild, crazy conspiracies in order to advance their aims. And reactionary, of course, is that rather than sort of progress toward a better state, improve life for everybody, they emphasize a return to a kind of imaginary version of the American past, a version that includes sort of elements of regressive social order, the suppression of certain forms of speech, attacks on the religious freedom of those who fail to conform, and other features. So, obviously, not everybody who wants to go back to the good old days is a nihilist. We all sometimes long for certain elements of the past that we found simpler and easier to handle and perhaps better. But the people who believe that a democratic political system and its ideals and institutions are so bad that they need to be totally destroyed, and at the same time they exalt a completely fictitious idea of what they think the past was, and think that we need a king to bring it about. I mean, I think these people count as nihilists, you know? Their vision is not based on reality, you know? So when you talk about those wild-eyed folks like Curtis Yarvin, I mean, have you tried reading his stuff?
I mean, it's insanity, and and I'm gonna do a podcast here pretty soon on, I'm gonna decode and decipher Mark Andreessen's insanity too, right? Which is well, let me actually ask you a question. It seems like so much of this, especially not on the Christian side, not on the religious side, but on the tech goon side, Catherine, they're looking for, it seems to me, after reading so much of this, that they are looking for a replacement for God. What do you make of this? Because it seems that the non-religious piece of this movement is still looking for the one. They're still looking for that one thing that's bigger than them. That again seems to me, I don't have any expectation that Elon Musk believes in God, right? But he believes in
No.
himself maybe as a god or godlike. And that's really weird to me, is that so much of this weirdness, and it could be the masculinity and it could be all of the other strangeness that comes along with these people, is that they're also searching for something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one thing we have to keep in mind is that a lot of people who are as rich as they are almost like living in bubbles or islands, where they're surrounded by people telling them how amazing and brilliant they are. But they can kind of hear, I say, from over the walls, the voices of their critics saying, "You know, your business that you're getting involved in is kind of leading to antisocial consequences, and maybe it's actually not improving the world." And they start to feel threatened. And I think there's sort of like a negative feedback cycle where the more exploitive they are, the more extreme their concentrations of wealth come at the expense of people further down the economic ladder, the more criticism they get, and the more criticism they get, the more defensive they become. That point has been made about Andreessen specifically. I mean, what seems to motivate him, frankly, is that he seems to feel disrespected. He thinks he helped create the modern world and should be rewarded for it and thanked. And instead, he gets some criticism, and that makes him defensive. Now, we can't be sure. We don't know what's in their hearts, but we don't know what's in Peter Thiel's heart or Musk's heart. But I think people like Musk and Andreessen, they're not motivated by Christian nationalism, but they certainly view it as the price of doing business, right? Because it's the only way to get the rank and file on board. You give them an identity, you make them, sort of uh, into the right, proper, obedient sort of Americans and obedient voters that they want, and then they get the power, and they get the power.
I think about when you talked about Andreessen believed he helped create the modern world and, wants to be rewarded, wants to be thanked, and I think back to that scene that's run a million times on social media of Don Draper talking to Peggy in Mad Men. He goes, "That's what the money is for." Right? Like,
I
that's
know.
your reward, right? Like, if you wanna be loved, get a dog. No one needs to love Mark Andreessen because he created Netscape, right? Like, congratulations. You're a billionaire. That's the reward. And to your point, it's strange that now they have so much money that they look for some other reward. And again, I think you're right. I think it's power. But let's talk about how that power becomes destructive. And you reference this several times, and I think we're seeing it in real time, which is the destruction of the administrative state. And this is something, as you note, Steve Bannon started talking about. He calls himself a Leninist, not a John Leninist, but a Vladimir Leninist. That everything must be burned to the ground and rebuilt in the image of, whether or not it's God or Elon Musk. I don't think Donald Trump really has much of a vision other than gold and weirdness. Um, so talk about why that's so important to this movement.
Functioning government institutions are central to the functioning of a democracy. Experts, this is a movement that's always deriding experts because experts stand in the way of unearned wealth and privilege. Um, they want a king, obviously, who's going to break the rules. They love Trump because he breaks the rules. He's moving the goalpost and then he moves them again and he's moving them again. He's destroying the norms of our democracy as well. He's destroying the norms of the way we used to deal with politics. Look, I feel like our country functions best when you have two functioning political parties that engage in the sort of the politics of give and take and compromise. But this is a movement that doesn't believe in compromise. It's always like my way or the highway. And autocrats always divide people. They divide between the good, true representatives of the nation and the impure other, right? And this is what Donald Trump does. He says, I alone can fix it. He says at his rallies, he always says some version of the greatest threat to our country is not our foreign enemies, as dangerous as they may be. The greatest threat is the threat from within. And when they say the threat from within, they're including everyone from
Well, they're talking about
rhinos
you and
to
me.
they're talking about you and me, exactly. We're the threat from within. They're not talking about this sort of, just folks on the fringe left, which, by the way, a lot of the fringe left, actually, their actions were down to the benefit
Of course.
of the right. And that's something that I write about in Money, Lies, and God. I think sometimes that those features of that sector are poorly understood. But, it stands in the way of autocracy, and that's why they want to destroy a functioning administrative state. That's why they want to get rid of experts who are gonna ground their decisions in reason, who are going to respect the institution. We've got this funny democracy. It's like, got all these kind of sclerotic different features. But at the same time, it has been this marvelous experiment. It's delivered in its, better moments, a kind of prosperity, spirit of innovation, and a kind of ideals of equality. They're pretty unique. And these are folks who often derive their fortunes from the benefits that our democracy has conferred onto them. And yet here they want to destroy it. And it's really it's kind of sad and sick.
Look, going back to all of these guys, Musk, Bezos, Andreessen, all of them, if it hadn't been for a bunch of nerds in the Pentagon basement figuring out how to connect computers to each other, none of these guys would have anything. Frankly, you and I wouldn't be talking like we are now. And so that's the thing, is like there's just this complete and total lack of first and foremost understanding, but then appreciation of like, but for what we all paid for, you all would not have this. And again, I think that's also, we're downstream too of, bad policy decisions. In 1996, right? They said we're going to let the internet run. Well, we didn't know what it was going to become. But here's where we are now. They're saying, well, maybe we should do the same with AI. I don't want to get too policy based on you, Catherine, but like maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe we should do this, because my fear, to bring it back to your book and to what we're facing, is that just like the internet, just like modern, deindustrialization created massive economic shocks and disruption, so will a new technology like AI, and not for people in factories, but for people with college degrees, like the people the work I used to do at a PR firm, right? Where I had, me and a senior vice president and two or three associates. You won't need the associates anymore. Right? The law firms theoretically won't. I mean, they'll always have them because they want to build, but you don't necessarily won't need paralegals or first year associates to write the first draft of a brief. And I think that if we don't do that, if we let this stuff run completely, then we're going to have more dislocation, and it's going to drive people further into the arms of this kind of stuff because they're looking for anything to hold on to.
That's really true, and I wanna say something that the movement does right. They really give people a sense of belonging. They give people a
Yes.
sense of community. They give people an immediate, uh, path to activism, and that's something you really don't see so much on the left. Look, I went to the last Democratic, National Convention. It's the first one I'd ever been to. I was very interested to sort of see what it was like, and when you go to a right-wing conference, let's not even talk about, like, the Republican National Convention. You go to any right-wing conference, there are all these tables there, and they're offering you a path to activism. You're interested in, oh, you're against abortion. Here are all the things you can do. You could start a chapter in your community if you don't have one, or you can join this chapter. Oh, you wanna, you're a mom. Oh, here they're teaching this insane thing in your kid's public school, which they're probably not teaching, but or at least not in the way that they say they are. But here you can get involved with this moms group where there's an immediate sense of community, path to power. This is what 50 years of infrastructure building and billions of dollars gets you, a real sense of community, a sense that you're part of something larger than yourself that is remaking the world. And they do offer a very positive vision of America, at least on a superficial level, to the rank and file, a sense of patriotism.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I attended an event a couple of weeks ago, and I think this is probably a dubious distinction. But the host, called me out by name, not negatively, and said, Reed said something that has stuck with me, which is the Democratic Party is a big tent with a small door. Like, you got to work to get in, right? Like, they don't just take anybody.
We need to stop purity testing one another. Something, I've been for the last 16 years going to these right-wing conferences, et cetera. And something I started to hear the last couple of years is a lot of people were paraphrasing Ronald Reagan, and they said, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. They were doing this to remind people, you're not going to agree with people on everything, but you can agree on these things. Then you can work together, and you should. And I think that we kind of for those who want to support a pro-democracy movement, we need to do the same thing. Stop purity testing one another. If we can agree on some fundamental principles, the principles of equality, the importance of our democracy and its institutions, then we should be able to find ways to work together.
Right, and look, I mean, that's been my mantra for the last few years, which is I'll work with anybody who'll work with me. Not everybody will. All right, fine. But, like, this is where I'm going. If you wanna go along, that's fine. If you don't like me because I used to have an R behind my name or I used to work for George, like, fine. Like, I don't care, right? Like, your approbation or your looking down your nose at me affects me not at all, right? But it would be better if we worked together. And I think that's hard for people because, again, I've been down the path, right? I left the Republican. I was never really a conservative, Catherine, right? But I left the Republican Party as soon as Trump was going to be the nominee. I said, not for me anymore. So, like, I'm almost 10 years into the journey. I understand for others it's harder, but it's also, I think, important for our friends who are listening to this to understand, like, do you want to win or not? Do you want to save the country or don't you? If you're going to be beholden to your perspective, which you may hold as close to anything as you possibly can, but aren't willing to unravel that a little bit for the greater good, then, like, are you part of the solution or are you part of the problem?
Well, here's the other thing they do right. They really emphasize, like, getting out the vote. They get their people out in disproportionate numbers, like the sort of hardcore of the Christian nationalist movement. I think George Barna, he's a pollster who is, very sort of embedded within the movement. In 2016, he said he identified a group of this sort of hardcore, like, called them sage cons, spiritually active, conservative, engaged conservatives, and he said, something like 92% turned out to vote, or maybe 91%, 96% voted for Trump, and the numbers were even higher, have, like, gone even higher. So if you can get out people to vote in disproportionate numbers, you don't need a majority of the population, obviously, to win elections, but they really emphasize getting out the vote in some really organic ways. So I'll just tell you a story about what I heard when I was at America Fest last December in Phoenix, Arizona. I go to this presentation and a woman was talking about the Get Out the Vote initiative. She said, in your community, there's 20,000 people. She said, in your community, host a barbecue, but don't host it in September if the election is in November. Host it in March and
Yes.
don't talk about the vote. Just invite Republicans and just get
Yes.
to know everybody. It's this relational organization. Then when you come back around in June and then you come back around August, then you come back around September, they know who you are. There's a sense of trust. There's a sense you already have a sense of community, and therefore you're a trusted voice, and then you can reach people. And I just think that's so clever. It's like if you're gonna have an election in November, you can't start, messaging through TV ads in September. It is simply not gonna be as effective as a trusted voice in your community who had you over for a barbecue, who's like, "Say, Mrs. Jones, have you thought about the election, and are you thinking about whatever the issue might be?" It's just that kind of relational organizing is really critical. And here's another thing I want to say. This is a movement that exists separate from the Republican Party. And for many years, I think the Republican Party thought, well, we can make use of these people because they deliver a really reliable slice of the vote. Now they have taken it over, and like the guardrails have fallen away from the Republican Party. And Republican, true conservatives of a previous era are probably rolling in their graves.
I've told this story before, and everybody knows I like to repeat myself. So, on the 2004 Bush Cheney campaign, right, the reelection campaign, there was a big conference room. I don't remember what we called it. Doesn't matter. And we'd have these meetings, big meetings with department heads and everybody else. And there was one guy, Catherine, who was responsible for the social conservatives. One guy. We had 2 floors of an office building, and there was one guy, right, in the coalitions department. His name was Gary. And Gary wore the same gray suit, the same white shirt, the same red tie, had the same sort of, high and tight haircut. And we thought Gary was weird. And to your point, we thought he was in there with us. And what we didn't know in our arrogance was that we were in there with him. And it was just a matter of time. We didn't understand the nature of the power of the movement he represented. And we took it for granted. We said, where else are those people going to go? not ever believing, because then we had McCain in '08 and then we had Romney in 2012, that, it would be a short 12 years, right, between George W. Bush's reelection and the end of the Republican Party, and it is over, as we knew it. And that's one of those things that, again, that's the whether again, for Republicans like me, as I was at the time, that was the arrogance of the insider, right? Like, it's our party. We know what to do with it. I don't even really like Republican activists. They're a means to an end, right? I need motorcade drivers when I was an advance guy. They'll always show up, right? We need to fill the crowd. Like, the churches will always provide the people. But to your point, at the end of the day, they're like, oh, wait, we don't need you, right? We have everything we need.
We're gonna control you. Exactly. We're gonna primary any one of you that doesn't adhere to our extreme positions, and this is what they do. They, because of a lot of gerrymandering, a lot of Republican politicians are never gonna go up against a Democrat, of course. They're gonna and the only way to really win is to not let anybody get to the right of them because the Christian nationalist movement has that voter turnout machine. So the movement leaders will push their people to embrace more and more radical policy decisions. So that's why you've ended up with more and more sort of uncompromising positions on the right.
Let me ask you something. You referenced this in the book, and you just alluded to it. When Donald Trump leaves, whether or not it's in 4 years, hopefully, or when he shuffles off the mortal coil, what happens to this movement? I mean, I feel like the money lies in God movement, got incredibly lucky, right? If luck is the definition of when preparation meets opportunity, Donald Trump was their best opportunity.
Oh, he's great for them because he breaks things.
Yeah, and he doesn't care, right? He doesn't care about any of
No.
it. So what happens when he is gone? Because that's one thing that people said, "Oh, do you think it'll go back to normal?" I said, "First of all, whatever sense of normal you had is gone. It's gone forever." And it could have been gone after 9/11. It could have been gone after Hurricane Katrina or the great financial meltdown, COVID or Trump, whatever. Like, you just got to get that world is now in the rear view mirror. But what happens now? Because to your point about the gerrymandering in so many of these states, it's not like these people now are all 10 years, if not more, into this sort of politics. Call it Trumpism, we call it nationalism. I just don't get the sense that if he goes away in whatever form, that suddenly they're going to have their Rip Van Winkle moment and go, oh, I think some people will. I think there will be some people, but I don't think it'll be enough to just say, well, that time, we're over it, right? He's gone and now it's over.
Yeah. I mean, I left my crystal ball in the other room, but I will say this. The movement is really good at leadership development. When I was at America Fest, which is funded, run by Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's organization, you can see they're bringing a lot of young people and finding people who are talented and have the right sort of ideological approach, and then grooming them for leadership in these different areas of the movement. So I don't think the movement will be like, oh no, Trump is gone. What are we going to do? I mean, there are people waiting in the wings who would like to sort of continue to carry out the same agenda that frankly long preceded Trump and will long outlast him. On the other hand, I think as the consequences start really hitting for people, as prices rise due to needless trade wars, as functions of government stop really working properly in ways that serve the American people, as people lose out on benefits they deserve or need, as we start seeing like a feeding frenzy at the very top of the economic food chain, as a lot of Americans lose their religious freedom, as they lose their rights. I think, the bill is going to come due at a certain point. And question is the propaganda machine in the anti-democratic movement, is it going to be strong enough to actually persuade people that it's still in their interest to vote a certain way? I mean, this is why autocrats often want to take over functions of the media. Let's look at what Orban did in Hungary. Look at what happens in Russia. Where opposition journalists have had to leave the country or end up in the the gulags. I mean, the war on the truth is really important for autocrats. We just it all remains to be seen.
I think, unfortunately, what history has taught us is that when those economic hardships start to be felt, the response is not to reverse them to make it easier, but to clamp down on, to your point, the media or activism, right, through the organs of the state. I mean, as we're talking about this, Kash Patel has now been confirmed as director of the FBI, and a guy I worked for many years ago, right, when he was a moderate Republican running for U.S. Senate in Maryland, Dan Bongino, the dimmest of the dim bulbs.
What happened to him? Is it money? He was like, "Oh my god, I could make more money if I get super extreme and crazy."
He was the perfect example of a guy who, even from the reason why we parted ways was because he had been invited to go on Good Morning America to talk about something that had happened within the Secret Service where he used to work, and he said he was gonna what he was gonna say was just gonna be a lie on national television. And I'm like, you can't do that. You can't lie on national television. Like, that's how naive I was in 2014, right? But all he cared about was being on television, was being famous. And then you had somebody who could come in and he could coast, in their wake. And yeah, it's easy, right? It's been easy for all of these people. And the people who could have stopped them over the years refused to, because they had their own vested interests. And I don't I you take a guy like Mitch McConnell, like, good riddance, right? Good riddance. You had plenty of opportunities to make this go away, and you chose not to, and now here we are. And so Bongino is just one more fellow traveler who's gotten extremely wealthy and is now going to be extremely powerful.
Nihilists, I tell you. They worship money, and they use lies, and God, the exploitation of religion to get it.
Right, and, they all might dislike each other more than they dislike you and me, right? But for the moment, like, I saw something like James Carville's like, "The Trump administration is gonna collapse in 30 days." Like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you talking like, he's not leaving office. JD Vance isn't leaving office. The Republicans aren't not gonna be in control of Congress. The Supreme Court is not gonna continue rolling over. Elon Musk is not gonna, be not gonna stop joyfully running around ripping the switches out of everything. Like, when you say that, like, what do you mean? That sort of level of either you're doing it for the clicks or you're that naive is very troubling to me.
I think we have to really understand the different factions. We have to understand the sort of religious right leaders and activists. I mean, look, some of them are doing it for money and power, and others truly believe, like, two things can be true at once. Some of them are true believers. They really want certain policies. I think about somebody like Leonard Leo, who recognized years ago that the policies he really wanted, truly, genuinely wanted, would never be popular among the rank and file. And he thought, well, if we get the courts, we can impose them on people, and then everybody will get in line. And then he became a sort of money man for the right wing legal ecosphere. He's now in charge of the Marble Freedom Trust, funded by Barry Side
To the tune of 1.6 billion with a B, billion
with a
dollars.
B. They can spend 230 plus $1 million a year without touching the nut. That's a lot of money. A lot of money buys a lot of law. So I think that that faction, they are like, whoever wins, that faction has been working on changing the law for decades. When I started writing on these topics 16 years ago, when I found something happening in our kids' public elementary school district that seemed a little weird, and it sort of took me down the rabbit hole. But back then, Obama was the president, and people, I could see where the right wing legal ecosphere was taking this. I could see that they had a strategy that they were going to use to try to destroy democracy in a sense. And I became concerned, and people like, "What are you talking about? Obama's the president." But no matter who is the president, this cohort has been working steadily at redefining the whole idea of religious liberty and recasting, sidelining the Establishment Clause because they really want to smash it up, and redefining what our country is, and they're never giving up no matter who wins, the next election. But again, elections matter. I've been to so many conferences, like, where you've got the more sort of religious right side of things rather than the new right side of things, and they'll say, "This election is about judges, judges, judges." And so, judges really do judicial appointments really do matter. So, I don't wanna be, nihilistic myself about the prospects for change, and again, in the final section of Money, Lies, and God, I outline recommendations for, I think, what we could do, and organization really, really does matter.
No, and that's where I was about to go. As I told you before we started recording, it was like you've been on our Zooms for the union, join the union.us. And here's what you said, right? Think long term, right? Again, guys, they've been at this a long time. You can't start talking to voters on Labor Day of the election year. Invest in organizations and people. How many different conferences have you been to? How many different conferences have you referred to, Catherine, just in this episode? There's always somewhere and someplace and something for people to get together, right, with this movement. Build coalitions. Again, what we were talking about earlier. You don't have to agree on everything. You just have to agree on enough. And lastly, go local, right? To your point, don't start with politics, right? People clearly, how many more times do I have to hear? And I'm sure you're hearing it the same way, Catherine. Like, I'm so sick of it. I've tuned out. I don't want to hear the news. I don't want to read the news, right? Then get together at your kid's basketball game, right? Go like, hey, let's, get a guys group together for dinner. It's been a while since we've all seen each other. Men are, horrendously bad at getting together, and what you find is I don't want to, again, this shouldn't be, it shouldn't be performative. You should take a genuine interest in the things that, those people that you're with are saying. There's going to be a lot of people maybe you disagree with. Maybe a couple of MAGA people show up. Okay. Like saying, get out of here. You're MAGA, right? Also not a great way to bring them back to the fold, if that's such a thing is ever going to be possible. But you have to start where you can, which is, and this is one thing I would say to my Democratic listeners, like, it's not always going to be about the next federal election. It's not going to be about the next president. I don't want to hear about 2028. The House is on fire now, right? Like, and we have no idea what 2028 is going to look like. So like now is where the work has to start. And I think that's why the exposition of your story, the illustration of your story, and as you also say, knowledge is power, making sure people understand how this stuff is happening, why it's happening, and what the ultimate goal for these people is, I think is so crucial.
Thank you so much, and thank you so
Absolutely.
much for reading the book.
Look, I have a rule. I've said this before. I don't if I'm going to have someone on to talk about their book, I'm going to do them the courtesy and actually read the book. First and foremost, because I love to read, but also because you've put a lot of work, you've done a lot of stuff. I can't imagine how many times you put yourself or your career or anything else on the line. You spend a lot of time on airplanes going to spend time with people who don't like you, right? And the least I can do is read a very good book. And I hope everybody else gets out there and does it too. Catherine, before we let you go, where can we find you online? And obviously we can find your book at every good purveyor of new reading out there.
Thank you so much. I have a website, katherinestewart.me. I just wanna boast for a second. I just got a really lovely review in the New York Times, of Money, Lies, and God, so it's worth looking up. And I'm on Twitter at Kath S. Stewart. There are 2 S's. I'm also on Blue Sky at Catherine, I think it's Katherine Stewart dot Blue Sky. And thank you so very much for, meeting with me today. It's really great to see you again.
No, Catherine, thank you. And hopefully next year in Jerusalem, as they say, right? Well, not quite to Passover. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter, says.us, and TikTok at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA. And guys, please go to my Substack, The Home Front, sign up, subscribe, write 3 times a week, get everything you need to know about the work we got to do, the fight we're in, and make sure that, as Catherine said, you know what you need to know. Knowledge is power. Katherine Stewart, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.